As a cross-border financial planner, we hear this comment all of the time. Brian, I'm not going to move money from Canada to the US right now. The exchange rate is awful. I'm going to wait till it gets better. Today, we're going to talk about why that might be a mistake. Hello, my name is Brian Haggard. I'm a certified financial planner, chartered financial analyst, and I'm the founder of Retirement and Financial. We help simplify your cross-border retirement plan. And one of the topics that we have to discuss with a lot of our clients is what's the best strategy for moving money from Canada to the US? When to do it? How do we get the money down here? And once the money's here, how do we get that money invested for them? Now, in today's conversation or in today's video, we're really going to talk about your non-registered accounts up in Canada. That would be like your cash, your savings, your checking. You might have GICs. You might even have a non-registered retirement account. I'm sorry, non-registered brokerage account up in Canada as well. We're not really talking about liras or RRSPs. That's a whole different conversation because not only do we take into account exchange rate when we're moving that money over, we also have to take into account taxes. So this is really going to be talking a lot about your non-registered accounts. And this came up this week because I had a client I was talking to, and a couple of years back, I made the suggestion that he move some of his funds down from Canada to the US to get it invested. And today he came back to me. He never ended up doing that. Today he came back and said, Brian, I wish I would have taken your advice 2 years ago. It's probably cost me tens of thousands of dollars. So we decided I wanted to go back and revisit that conversation and what can we do going forward? So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to kind of review and look at what's the exchange rate history between the Canadian dollar and the US dollar. What's the opportunity cost or how much it might be costing you to keep that money up in Canada? We'll talk about some different investment options, both here in the States and in Canada, and then other reasons that you may want to move that money now. So let's look a little bit at what has been the historical average for the US dollar and the Canadian dollar exchange rate. Now, I always like to look at it from Canadian dollar to US dollar because that's what most of our clients are doing. They're moving the money from Canada to the US. And I'd like to know how many cents on the dollar are they going to actually get by making that change. Now, again, we hear all the time from clients, well, I'd like to wait. I'd like to make sure the exchange rate gets better. But what does that actually mean? Sure, we probably all remember back in 2011 when we hit par for both the US and Canadian dollar. But that's been a long time. And since then, and especially since the last 10 years, the Canadian exchange rate has been really, really weak. So if we look at where the current rates are, and as we're talking to you today, current rates are a little over 70 cents on the dollar if you were to move money down from the US or from Canada to the US. Pretty ugly, right? But how does that compare to some of the longer term averages? Well, over the last year, the average has been a little bit over 73 cents on the dollar. And if you look at the last 5 and 10 years, that number's been closer to about 76 cents on the dollar. You can see over the last 5 years, about a little, just under 76 cents. Over the last 10 years, it's been just over 76 cents. Now, these last 10 years or so have been a really strong period for the US dollar, a weaker period for the Canadian dollar. If we look at the last 20 years average, we're actually over closer to about 85 cents on the dollar. And that's because the 10-year prior to these last 10 years were pretty good for the Canadian dollar. That was a period in which the US was going through a pretty major recession. There was a time when the different rating agencies were actually downgrading US debt at the time as well. So during that time, the US dollar was pretty weak. And that's why we saw such a really significant exchange rate difference. Now, what have we seen? The last 10 years have really been dominated. The US has really been the main economic superpower as far as our stocks are concerned over the last 10 years, doing much better than most countries out there. And as a result, we're seeing the US dollar has been really, really strong over those time frames. And so The number that I always like to look at here is the number on the right here. Really, how much lower are we today compared to where we are on average? So, if you look at the long-term average, right now, at least over the last 5 to 10 years, we're about 6 to 7% lower than our long-term average. And why do I like to look at that number? For people who are waiting, who want to wait on the exchange rate to improve, if it improves to just historically where the long-term average has been over the last 5 or 10 years, you're going to get about a 7% bump to your money by waiting for those long-term averages. But what's the issue with that? How if it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get to those long-term averages? Is it really worth it for us to continue to wait to convert money from Canadian dollars to US dollars just so that we can get a 6 or 7% better rate of return? Certainly that's beneficial if we only have to wait a year or two, but if we're waiting 3 or 4 years before we might get back to those historical averages, it's not very much of a rate of return at all. We're looking at 1 to 2% per year that maybe we're benefiting by waiting to move that money from Canadian dollars to US dollars. Yes, I know we'd all like to get back to 80, 90, even par again, but that might be quite a bit down the road. And again, how long does it make sense for us to wait? Maybe earning not a lot here in Canada while we're waiting to move that money down here. Let me give you kind of the example of the client when what he wanted to do. So, 2 years ago, December 2022, he had 400,000 Canadian in a checking account. It's actually a savings account up in Canada, earning 2% rate of return. And his whole comment was, hey, Brian, the exchange rate's 73 cents on the dollar. I don't want to move the money over and only get 73 cents on the dollar. So I'm just going to keep it up here in Canada. I'm earning 2% per year on my money, and I'll just kind of wait to move the money down here. And now where are we today? So his 400,000 Canadian has earned 2% per year over the last 2 years. And ultimately, if he were to move his money down here today at today's exchange rate, which is a little over 70 cents on the dollar, you would get about 295,000 US. Now let's look at the example of what would have happened if you would have moved the money back in 2022 to the US and then invested that money. So instead of having $400,000 Canadian, he could have converted that money to US dollars a couple of years ago. And that would have given him $292,000 or so. The nice thing though is his money down here in the United States has been earning, about 10% per year for the last few years. So in that situation, he would have earned quite a bit more down here in the States than he was earning up in Canada. And that would have resulted in over $350,000 here in the States compared to 295,000 that he has right now up in Canada. If he moved his money down here now, it's an extra $55,000 that he potentially would have had by moving that money down to the States earlier and getting that money invested. And so this is the big question to ask. Now, certainly we don't know two things. We don't know where the exchange rate's going, and we don't necessarily know what the US stock market's going to do. It's been doing well, but doesn't mean that it's always going to do well, right? But certainly the opportunity down here, especially if you're a long-term investor, is traditionally you're going to do a little bit better in the States, especially invested, as opposed to just keeping the money in Canada. And these are some of the things that you need to consider when you're trying to decide if you want to move the money down here. First of all, is how is your money actually invested in Canada? For a lot of people, when I see they have large sums of money up in Canada, it's in checking accounts, savings accounts. Maybe it's in GICs that are currently yielding relatively low, and as interest rates go down, are going to continue to yield a smaller amount. Now, if that's the case, then you might want to decide move the money down here where you have a lot more investment options. Now, other clients have that money in Canadian equities or stocks up in Canada. That's perfectly fine, but we'll also kind of discuss here in a minute. U.S. stock exchange has done quite a bit better than the Canadian stock exchange. Again, we don't know where that's necessarily going, but that's historically been the case over the last 10 years or so. So still in that situation, you may find it better to move down to the States. The other things that you want to consider is if the money was here in the States, how would you invest it? If your thought is, I'm going to keep the money in a savings account in Canada or a savings account in the US, might not really matter where the money's at. You're probably going to earn about the same amount of interest in either places. But if your thought is, hey, right now it's just in a basic interest earning GIC or savings account, we're going to wait to get the money down to the States to invest it. Again, we don't know what that money's going to do short term, but historically longer term, getting that money invested is going to typically result in larger rates of return. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the opportunity cost? How much am I giving up on an annual basis? Not by the exchange rate, but just by keeping money up in Canada in these potentially lower interest bearing accounts, as opposed to some of the investment options that you might have down here in the States. So here are some reasons that you may want to move the cash to the States sooner rather than later. One is more investment options. You're typically going to find that if you're a US resident, it's much easier to invest here in the States than it is in Canada. It's easier to buy stocks here in the States. You can typically do it online. You don't have to call somebody to do it. The other thing is that you have to be really mindful. If you have non-registered accounts in Canada, certain investments can trigger really negative tax ramifications. You're really not supposed to have mutual funds or exchange traded funds up in Canada. Those are all things that you can own here in the US, and it's going to be much friendlier than what you would have up in Canada. The other thing is, if you have all these investments up in Canada, you need to report that. You need to report it as FBARs. You have to have maybe 8938 forms. It's just additional tax reporting that you need to do on a year-to-year basis. Now, if you are investing and you're trying to compare, am I better off investing in the US versus the States? Over the last 5 to 10 years, certainly you would have been better off investing in the States. Over the last 10 years or so, the Canadian equities have earned about 4% per year. Compared that to about 15% in the US markets. Over the last 5 years, the US stock market has more than doubled the Canadian market. So even if you're investing in both places, you may be giving up some ground by keeping that money up in Canada versus investing here in the States. Again, no guarantee of what that will look like in the future, but it's possible. The other thing is people keep waiting for the exchange rate to get better, but over the last 10 years ago or so, it keeps on getting worse, right? I showed you that example of my client who wanted to wait a couple years to move money down. He wanted to get the exchange rate better, but a couple years ago it was at 73 cents, and today we're barely over 70 cents on the dollar. Certainly things were much better back in the early to mid 2010s, where the Canadian dollar was quite a bit stronger. Certainly we might get to that point again, but there's certainly no guarantee of it. And we saw that the Canadian dollar was significantly stronger than what it was in the past. So, those are all reasons that you may decide that you want to move the money down to the States. Not to mention, it just is easier. It's easier to have all of your money kind of at one custodian or maybe a couple, as opposed to having investment accounts here in the States, retirement accounts here in the States, retirement accounts in Canada, other investment accounts in Canada, right? At the end of the day, it's a lot easier to have that money in one spot as opposed to in a lot of different places. Thank you so much for listening today. My name is Brian Haggard, certified financial planner, chartered financial analyst, founder of Retirement and Financial. If you're interested in learning more about our services, you can go to our website, retirementin.com, and you can schedule a complimentary consultation with one of our experienced cross-border financial advisors. Thank you very much.